June 4th, 1942, 10:22 a.m. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey gripped the stick of his Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bomber as he scanned the endless expanse of Pacific blue, stretching 19,000 feet below. His fuel gauge showed dangerously low levels. His squadron of 37 dive bombers had been searching for the Japanese carrier fleet for over 2 hours with no contact. Radio chatter crackled through his headset as frustrated pilots reported empty ocean in every direction. What McCluskey didn't know was that he was about to witness the most devastating 15 minutes in naval aviation history. Within a quarter hour, American dive bombers would transform 4 of Japan's most powerful aircraft carriers into floating infernos, fundamentally altering the course of World War II in the Pacific. The question that haunted Japanese admirals for decades afterward was devastating, yet straightforward. How did the Americans catch their carriers so completely exposed? The answer lies in a perfect storm of tactical brilliance, incredible timing, and fatal Japanese miscalculations that created the most vulnerable moment in the history of carrier warfare. This is the story of how American dive bombers exploited that moment and delivered a blow from which the Japanese Navy never recovered. To understand why the Japanese carriers were so catastrophically exposed, we need to rewind 6 months to December 7th, 1941. Pearl Harbor had been a tactical masterpiece for Japan, but it contained the seeds of their ultimate downfall at Midway. The attack had demonstrated the devastating effectiveness of carrier aviation, but it had also revealed something else, something the Japanese High Command failed to recognize until it was too late. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of Pearl Harbor, understood that Japan's window of opportunity was closing rapidly. American industrial capacity would eventually overwhelm Japanese forces through sheer production volume. The only solution was to force a decisive battle that would cripple American naval power permanently. Midway Atoll, a strategic outpost 1,300 miles northwest of Hawaii, became his chosen target. The Japanese plan was elegant in its complexity. 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, would strike Midway's defenses while a massive invasion fleet captured the atoll. When American forces rushed to defend Midway, they would sail directly into a carefully prepared trap. Japanese submarines would whittle down the American fleet during their approach, while the combined fleet would deliver the knockout blow in surface combat. What made this plan so appealing to Japanese planners was their absolute confidence in carrier superiority. Their pilots were veterans of campaigns across China, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific. Their aircraft were proven in combat. Their carriers had operated together as a cohesive strike force for over a year. American carriers, by contrast, were scattered across the Pacific. Their pilots inexperienced, their coordination untested in significant fleet actions. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, commanding the 1st Air Fleet, had every reason for confidence as his 4 carriers steamed toward Midway on June 3rd. His strike force represented the world's most potent concentration of naval aviation. Between them, his carriers could launch over 250 aircraft, including the feared Mitsubishi A6M0 fighters that had dominated every aerial engagement since Pearl Harbor. But confidence bred complacency, and complacency would prove fatal. The Japanese had made 3 critical assumptions that would leave their carriers defensively helpless at the worst possible moment. First, they believed American codebreakers could not penetrate their communications. Second, they assumed American carriers were still in the South Pacific following the Battle of the Coral Sea. Third, they expected their own attack on Midway to proceed as scheduled without significant interference. All 3 assumptions were catastrophically wrong. Commander Joseph Rochefort and his team of codebreakers at Pearl Harbor had been systematically unraveling Japanese naval codes for months. By late May 1942, they possessed detailed knowledge of Japanese intentions, timing, and force composition. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commanding Pacific Fleet operations, knew exactly where the Japanese would strike and when they would arrive. More importantly, Nimitz had positioned his available carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown, northeast of Midway, in a perfect position to intercept the Japanese strike force. The Americans would have the element of surprise, the advantage of position, and the luxury of choosing when and how to engage. The Japanese carriers approached Midway at dawn on June 4th in a tight formation designed for mutual protection. Akagi and Kaga formed one division with their escorting destroyers, while Soryu and Hiryu operated as a second division several miles away. This concentration allowed overlapping anti-aircraft fire and coordinated fighter cover, making the formation nearly impregnable against conventional attack. At 4:30 a.m., Nagumo launched his first strike against Midway. 108 aircraft, including Kate torpedo bombers, Val dive bombers, and Zero escorts, departed the four carriers with orders to neutralize the American base. The attack was methodical, professional, and devastating. Midway's installations were systematically destroyed, while American defenders fought desperately against overwhelming odds. But the strike had an unintended consequence that would prove decisive. It left the Japanese carriers temporarily vulnerable, their decks cluttered with aircraft being prepared for a second attack wave. Standard doctrine called for maintaining a reserve strike force ready for immediate launch against unexpected targets. Nagumo initially followed this doctrine, keeping half his aircraft armed with anti-ship weapons aboard the carriers. Then came the first in a series of decisions that would seal Japanese fate. At 5:20 a.m., a Japanese reconnaissance aircraft reported American surface ships northeast of the carrier force. The pilot's initial message was frustratingly vague, mentioning only 5 ships without specifying their composition. Were they cruisers and destroyers, or did the force include carriers? Nagumo faced an agonizing choice. His second-wave aircraft were armed with high-explosive bombs for attacking land targets, not with armor-piercing bombs and torpedoes needed for naval combat. Rearming would take precious time, during which his carriers would be vulnerable to attack. But if American carriers were present, launching the second wave against Midway would leave him defensively exposed. At 5:30 a.m., Nagumo made the decision that doomed his fleet. He ordered the second wave rearmed with anti-ship weapons, believing he had sufficient time to complete the operation before American forces could threaten his carriers. The order triggered frantic activity across all 4 flight decks as ordnance crews rushed to remove land attack bombs and install naval torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs. What followed was organized chaos. Aviation fuel lines snaked across flight decks. Bombs and torpedoes lay stacked in neat rows awaiting installation. Aircraft engines warmed up as mechanics completed final preparations. The carriers had transformed from warships into floating ammunition depots, their decks crowded with the most volatile materials imaginable. At 6:20 a.m., the reconnaissance pilot finally clarified his earlier report. The American force included at least 1 carrier, possibly more. Nagumo's worst fears were confirmed, but by then it was too late. His aircraft were caught in the middle of rearming operations, unable to launch immediately either for defense or attack. The situation deteriorated further when Midway-based American aircraft began their attacks on the Japanese fleet. These were desperate, uncoordinated strikes by obsolete aircraft flown by inexperienced pilots. Marine Corps dive bombers, Navy torpedo planes, and Army Air Force bombers pressed home their attacks with suicidal courage against overwhelming odds. The American attacks were tactical disasters. Zero fighters slaughtered ancient Vought Vindicator dive bombers. Grumman Avenger torpedo bombers were shot down before reaching their attack positions. Boeing B-17 Flying Fortresses dropped their bombs from high altitude with predictably poor results. Not a single hit was scored on any Japanese carrier, but these failed attacks served a crucial purpose that American planners never intended. They forced Nagumo to keep his fighters at low altitude to defend against successive waves of attackers. When the critical moment arrived, Japanese combat air patrol would be out of position, their ammunition depleted, their fuel running low. At 7:05 a.m., the first strike aircraft began returning from Midway, their fuel tanks nearly empty, some bearing battle damage that required immediate attention. Nagumo faced another impossible choice. Land the returning aircraft immediately, or continue rearming the second wave for anti-ship attack. He couldn't do both simultaneously without creating dangerous congestion on the flight decks. Nagumo chose to recover his returning strike force first, a decision that seemed logical at the time. His pilots were running out of fuel and needed to land immediately. The American carriers, wherever they were, would still be hours away from launching position. There would be time to complete rearming operations after his aircraft were safely aboard. By 8:30 a.m., recovery operations were complete, but the rearming process had to begin again. Ordnance crews worked frantically to install anti-ship weapons while flight deck crews positioned aircraft for launch. Fuel lines remained connected to the plane as engines underwent final checks. The carriers were more vulnerable than ever, their decks crowded with armed aircraft, aviation fuel, and explosive ordnance. Unknown to Nagumo, American dive bombers were already airborne and searching for his fleet. 3 squadrons totaling 67 aircraft had launched from Enterprise and Yorktown at dawn, guided by the latest intelligence on Japanese positions. They flew in loose formations designed to cover maximum search area, their pilots scanning the horizon for the telltale smoke of the enemy fleet. The stage was set for the most decisive 15 minutes in naval history, minutes in maritime history. The first American strike waves had already failed catastrophically by the time McCluskey's dive bombers reached their search area. Torpedo Squadron 8 from the Hornet had been virtually annihilated, with only Ensign George Gay surviving the slaughter. Torpedo Squadron 6 from Enterprise suffered similarly devastating losses. 0 fighters tore apart Torpedo Squadron 3 from Yorktown before reaching the attack position. Of 41 American torpedo bombers that pressed home their attacks, only 6 returned to their carriers. These disasters confirmed Japanese superiority in every aspect of naval aviation. Their fighters were faster, more maneuverable, and flown by pilots with years of combat experience. Their anti-aircraft fire was accurate and intense. Their tactical coordination appeared flawless. American losses were so severe that Japanese commanders began celebrating what seemed to be another overwhelming victory. But the torpedo attacks had accomplished something their crews never lived to see. They had drawn Japanese fighter cover down to wave-top level, where 0 pilots expended ammunition and fuel while pursuing the low-flying devastators. More critically, they had fixed Japanese attention on the surface of the ocean, leaving the high-altitude approaches completely unguarded. At 10:20 a.m., Lieutenant Commander McCluskey made the decision that would alter the course of the Pacific War. His fuel gauges showed critical levels, with barely enough aviation gasoline remaining for the return flight to Enterprise. Standard procedure dictated immediate return to base, but McCluskey had spotted a lone Japanese destroyer steaming northeast at high speed, trailing a distinctive white wake across the blue Pacific. The destroyer was the Arashi, racing to rejoin the main fleet after depth, charging the American submarine Nautilus. To McCluskey, that wake represented a highway leading directly to the enemy carriers. Against all tactical doctrine, he followed the destroyer's course, gambling his squadron's fuel reserves on the chance that the Japanese warship would guide him to the target. 20 minutes later, McCluskey's gamble paid off spectacularly. At 10:22 a.m., the Japanese First Air Fleet materialized through the morning haze like a vision from a tactical manual. 4 massive carriers steamed in perfect formation, their flight decks crowded with aircraft, fuel lines, and ordnance. Destroyer escorts formed protective screens around each carrier division, while cruisers provided additional anti-aircraft firepower. What McCluskey saw below represented the most vulnerable moment in carrier warfare history. The Japanese had achieved tactical perfection in every aspect except timing. Their rearming operations were nearly complete, with aircraft spotted for launch and engines warming up across all 4 flight decks. In 15 minutes, possibly less, they would begin launching the most powerful carrier strike force ever assembled. But those 15 minutes would prove to be 14 minutes too many. McCluskey immediately grasped the tactical situation with the clarity of a veteran combat pilot. The Japanese carriers were caught in the worst possible configuration, their decks cluttered with armed aircraft, aviation fuel, and explosive ordnance. Their fighter cover was absent, still climbing back to altitude after engaging the torpedo bombers. Their anti-aircraft guns were the only defense against attack from above. The Enterprise squadrons had become separated during the long search, but fortune delivered an even greater advantage. As McCluskey positioned his 37 Dauntless dive bombers for attack on the nearest carriers, Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie appeared overhead with 17 additional SBDS from Yorktown. The two American formations had arrived simultaneously from different directions, catching the Japanese fleet in a perfect pincer movement. Leslie's squadron took position over the carrier Soryu, while McCluskey's aircraft lined up on Akagi and Kaga. The timing was so precise it might have been choreographed. Still, it was actually the result of identical tactical thinking by two experienced squadron commanders who recognized opportunity when they saw it. At 10:22 a.m., McCluskey transmitted the order that would echo through naval history. "Attack! Attack!" The simple command unleashed a coordinated assault that embodied everything American naval aviation had learned about dive bombing tactics. 47 Dauntless dive bombers rolled inverted and plunged toward their targets in the steepest, most aggressive attack profile their pilots had ever attempted. The Douglas SBD Dauntless had been explicitly designed for this moment. Its perforated dive brakes allowed controlled descent at angles approaching 70 degrees while maintaining accuracy. Its Norden bomb sight provided precision targeting capabilities that transformed dive bombing from art to science. Its 1,000-pound armor-piercing bomb could penetrate carrier flight decks and detonate deep within the ship's vitals. Japanese anti-aircraft gunners opened fire immediately, filling the sky with bursting shells and tracer bullets. But the American dive bombers were attacking from directly overhead, the most difficult angle for defensive fire. The Japanese had prepared for torpedo attacks from the horizon, not dive bombing from the zenith. Their gun crews struggled to elevate their weapons to maximum angle while tracking targets approaching at terminal velocity. Lieutenant Dick Best, leading the first section of Enterprise dive bombers, selected Akagi as his primary target. The flagship of the Japanese fleet presented a perfect profile, her flight deck crowded with Kate torpedo bombers being prepared for launch. Best's Dauntless screamed downward through increasingly intense anti-aircraft fire, his bomb sight centered on the carrier's forward elevator. At an altitude of 2,500 feet, Best released his 1,000-pound bomb and pulled out of his dive with crushing G-forces that grayed out his vision. Behind him, his wingmen followed in sequence, each aircraft adding another armor-piercing projectile to the rain of destruction falling on the Japanese flagship. The mathematical precision of American dive bombing tactics was about to demonstrate its devastating effectiveness against the most critical target in the Japanese fleet. Simultaneously, other sections of McCluskey's squadron were lining up on the carrier Kaga. The massive converted battlecruiser represented the most significant target in the enemy formation, her enormous flight deck packed with aircraft, fuel, and ordnance. The carrier was attempting desperate evasive maneuvers, but at 34,000 tons displacement, Kaga possessed all the maneuverability of a floating city. Lieutenant Commander Leslie's Yorktown squadron was delivering its own attack on Soryu with identical precision. The smaller carrier was attempting to launch fighters for defense, but the timing was catastrophically wrong. Aircraft were positioned for takeoff but not yet airborne, creating the maximum possible concentration of volatile materials on the flight deck. The convergence of American dive bombers from multiple directions created a tactical nightmare for Japanese defenders. Anti-aircraft guns could not engage all attacking aircraft simultaneously, forcing gun crews to choose targets while other bombers pressed home their attacks unopposed. The careful defensive coordination that had protected Japanese carriers for 6 months dissolved into chaos as individual gunners fired at whatever targets they could acquire. The mathematics of destruction was precise and merciless. Within 5 minutes, 3 of Japan's 4 fleet carriers had been transformed into blazing wrecks. Akagi, flagship of the 1st Air Fleet, took direct hits that ignited her aviation fuel and ordnance in a series of catastrophic explosions. Kaga suffered similar devastation as armor-piercing bombs penetrated her flight deck and detonated among rows of armed aircraft. Soryu erupted in flames that would burn for hours before she finally slipped beneath the Pacific waves. Only Hiryu escaped the initial American assault, her positions separated from the primary formation, providing just enough distance to avoid the coordinated dive bombing attack. But her reprieve would be temporary. American dive bombers would return that afternoon to complete the destruction of Japan's carrier striking force. The 15 minutes that doomed the Japanese fleet represented more than tactical brilliance or fortunate timing. They revealed the fundamental vulnerability of carrier operations when caught at the wrong moment. No amount of experience, training, or tactical skill could overcome the laws of physics governing aviation fuel, explosive ordnance, and high-velocity impacts from armor-piercing bombs. Admiral Nagumo's careful plans had collided with American code-breaking, bold tactical decisions, and the unforgiving realities of carrier warfare, and his fleet's moment of maximum vulnerability had coincided precisely with the arrival of American dive bombers operating at peak effectiveness. The result was the most decisive naval engagement in the history of the Pacific War. This victory permanently shifted the balance of power toward the United States and marked the beginning of Japan's long retreat across the Pacific.